American presidents may be defining figures of world history, but they're also still only human. These details about their final days are as tragic as they are revealing.
On April 14, 1865, just days after the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth.
Peace, empire, tyranny!
The killing took place while the president and his wife attended the comedic play Our American Cousin. Booth, himself a famous stage actor at the time, entered the box in which the Lincolns were seated and waited for a moment in the play that he knew would elicit a big laugh. At that point, he burst through the box's inner door and shot Lincoln in the back of his head with a .44 caliber Derringer pistol. Booth also slashed one of Lincoln's guests with a knife and then jumped onto the stage where he yelled either "The South is avenged" or "Sic semper tyrannis." The latter is Latin for "thus always to tyrants," the state motto of Virginia, a phrase which has long been associated with the assassination of the dictator Julius Caesar. The shooting occurred at some point between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Booth quickly escaped from the theater, and the 26-year-old actor would not be located by federal troops until 12 days later. He died in the ensuing standoff. Lincoln, meanwhile, immediately fell unconscious in the theater. An army surgeon, Charles Leal, ran to treat Lincoln and surmised that the wounds were likely fatal. The president was carried to a nearby boarding house and observed throughout the night by Dr. Robert King Stone, Lincoln's personal doctor. Stone recorded the change in Lincoln's appearance throughout the night. When he arrived, Lincoln was breathing softly, and he hoped that this might mean his wounds were not mortal. But the president's respiration soon became more labored. Stone noticed that Lincoln's right eye was surrounded by discoloration, and the pupil itself was dilated, while the left eye appeared normal. Throughout the night, however, the left pupil grew, and by the time of Lincoln's death, both pupils were equally enlarged. At one point, Stone made an unsuccessful attempt to locate the bullet by probing the wound, potentially causing Lincoln more harm in the process. In the end, Stone concluded that there was nothing left he could do. Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Lincoln's autopsy was performed at the White House by Army surgeons Edward Curtis and Joseph Janvier Woodward, while Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes was also in attendance. In a letter to his mother, Curtis wrote that Lincoln's body was placed on boards and covered with sheets and towels. He and Woodward began by removing the top of Lincoln's skull to trace the path of the bullet that killed him. They didn't locate it until they removed the brain from Lincoln's body, at which point the bullet fell out of the organ and into a china platter below his head. In his letter, Curtis wrote, "There it lay upon the white china, a little black mass no bigger than the end of my finger, dull, motionless, and harmless, yet the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize." In Woodward's autopsy report, the doctor noted that the bullet entered through the occipital bone, about 1 inch left of center and just above the left lateral sinus. The bullet lodged itself in the white matter of the cerebrum, damaging the left lateral ventricle in the process and filling the brain with blood. The track of the bullet was found littered with clotted blood and bone fragments, as well as fragments of the bullet itself. Externally, the area around Lincoln's eyes were discolored, and his eyes themselves were slightly bulging, which was the result of the buildup of blood in that area. When Curtis washed and weighed the brain, he found that it was of ordinary size and weight, apart from the areas that had been damaged in the shooting. In addition to performing the autopsy, the doctors also cut off a lock of Lincoln's hair at the request of his widow, Mary Todd Lincoln. The embalmer then prepared Lincoln's body for its public viewing. The former president went on display in an open coffin in the White House, the Capitol, and then across the country on a 13-day train journey. Reportedly, millions of Americans traveled to pay their respects to the late president.
In 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order triggering the public release of any and all still classified government documents relating to its investigation of J.F.K's assassination.
That's a big one, huh? A lot of people are waiting for this for years.
The materials finally surfaced on March 18, 2025, and while they don't contain much information not previously known to the public, a few of them shed some light on Lee Harvey Oswald's history with the Soviet Union. While it's common knowledge that Oswald spent time in the USSR prior to the murder of President Kennedy, there have long been rumors that he was somehow affiliated with the KGB. One document puts that idea to rest, however. Dated November 20, 1991, the communique reveals that a KGB agent identified as Slava Nikonov went through 5 extensive files to see if Oswald had ever worked for the secretive agency, then discussed his findings with the American college professor E.B. Smith. Nikonov believed that Oswald wasn't easily manipulated, which was a prerequisite characteristic for potential KGB agents at the time. And while he was rigorously observed by Soviet agents, they believe he offered no value to the agency. At one point, for example, they saw him doing target practice and deemed his shooting skills subpar. According to the Warren Commission, Oswald was the sole person responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Oswald took up a position in Dallas's Texas School Book Depository building. At around 12:30 p.m., the former U.S. Marine fired 3 shots at the president's passing motorcade. It was the third and final shot that struck Kennedy in the head, ultimately killing him. But the second bullet from Oswald's rifle also did a substantial amount of damage, as it tore through both the president and his riding companion, Texas Governor John Connally.
When I felt an impact, as if someone hit me with a closed fist.
The bullet entered Kennedy through his back and then exited through the neck. It continued to travel, striking Connally near his armpit, then moved through the governor's chest and body, injuring his wrist before stopping in his thigh.
Couldn't be a more horrible experience.
Since 1960, Secret Service agent Clint Hill had been assigned to First Lady Jackie Kennedy's security team. He was present on the Dallas trip in November 1963, and after hearing the first shot, he literally jumped into action, mounting the back of the car in an attempt to protect the president and his wife. Hill was only inches away from John F. Kennedy when he took that fatal shot to the head. He forced a panicked Jackie Kennedy to remain in her seat where she held her dying husband's head in her lap. The agent surveyed the profound injuries to the president and quickly realized that he wasn't likely to survive. According to Hill's memoir, the First Lady screamed out, "Jack, Jack, what have they done to you?" For decades after the assassination, Hill harbored extraordinary guilt over the fact that the president had died on his watch. He subsequently developed a drinking problem, isolated himself from his family, and even contemplated suicide.
I tried to do the best job I could. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough.
President Kennedy had suffered from back issues for most of his adult life, even undergoing multiple surgeries to help alleviate his near-constant pain. When making public appearances, Kennedy would wear a back brace that was a little like a corset. It covered his hips in addition to the majority of his back and was laced extremely tightly. All of that was then wrapped in a constricting fabric bandage. The system kept everything in place and thereby limited the president's pain, but it also seriously restricted his movements. The corset prevented even natural involuntary movements, and that may have been a contributing factor to his death. Kennedy was wearing the apparatus under his clothes when he rode in his limousine through Dallas. After he was shot the first time, his body likely would have recoiled, hunched over, and fallen to the floor of the car had the president been unencumbered. Instead, his body remained upright in the seat, giving Lee Harvey Oswald his chance to deliver the killing blow. When he heard the first shot ring out, Governor John Connally instantly realized what was happening. He looked across his right shoulder to see if Kennedy was all right, but couldn't see exactly what had happened. He then began to turn to his left, at which point he felt the bullet enter his body. Oswald's second bullet pierced one of the governor's lungs, and he required a 4-hour operation to remove it and repair the damage. In the end, he fully recovered from his injuries, but things could have turned out a lot worse for him had he not moved the way he did. The day after the shooting, attending physician Dr. Tom Shires told UPI, if he had not turned, that bullet would have gone through the middle of his back and probably would have punctured his heart. Obviously, Oswald intended to shoot and kill President Kennedy that day, and he also landed a shot on Governor Connally. But one more individual nearly died at Oswald's hand on November 22nd. James Tague, a 27-year-old Dallas car salesman, arrived at Dealey Plaza just as the presidential motorcade was winding through the area. Late for a lunch appointment, Tague parked his car to get out to see why crowds had gathered. Mere seconds later, he heard a popping sound. At first, he thought it was a firecracker. Then he noticed the distinctive sound of 2 rifle shots. He later told the BBC, "And with those last 2 shots, I felt something sting me in the face." He ran for cover behind an underpass pylon as the motorcade drove away. After speaking with 2 police officers who noticed blood on his face, Tague pieced together what had happened. He'd been struck by a piece of curb that flew into the air, dislodged by one of Oswald's bullets.
It's hard to grasp. Today, I'm still trying to grasp it.
Contrary to popular belief, Kennedy didn't die instantly in his car on Dealey Plaza. Instead, he suffered a long and slow demise, one that proved unspeakably harrowing for his wife. Following the assault, the driver of the presidential vehicle immediately went to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where President Kennedy was rushed into emergency surgery, but Kennedy's prognosis was never good. He arrived at the medical facility on what was described as just near the point of death. The president died on the operating table at Parkland. As Kennedy was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the rest of the world attempted to come to terms with what had just happened.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
Some reactions, though, were stranger than others. For example, the hospital where Kennedy was treated for his mortal wounds received a large volume of prank phone calls. When the Army Signal Corps took control of Parkland's outgoing phone lines, the hospital's switchboard operators were tasked with fielding and logging all received calls. Callers rang in from as far away as Europe, Australia, and South America. Many demanded more information, falsely claiming to be important people. One woman gave her identity only as the Underground and claimed she'd called to offer up her supernatural powers to heal the president. One man told the operator that he planned to blow up her car. Others blamed Kennedy's assassination on his support for the civil rights movement. One boy managed to call in 3 times, reaching 3 different operators. Each time, he claimed to be Kennedy's young son before laughing and hanging up. Secret Service agent Paul Landis was on Jackie Kennedy's security detail at the time of JFK's death. After witnessing the murder and the president's arrival at the hospital, Landis decided to investigate the car itself. That's when he noticed the spent bullet on the seat where Kennedy had been sitting. Landis, technically tampering with evidence, grabbed the bullet and placed it in his pocket. After entering the emergency room, he placed the bullet on the dying president's gurney, theorizing that it ought to remain with the body.
Yeah, I didn't want that to disappear. It was an important piece of evidence.
Landis was never interviewed by the Warren Commission, and he never publicly revealed that he'd taken the bullet until his memoir in 2023. In the book, Landis claimed that he'd simply forgotten to mention it to anyone. Pretty much every investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy has used the same historical document as a starting point, a 26.6-second piece of 8mm film captured by hobbyist photographer Abraham Zapruder. The unflinching footage graphically depicts the president sustaining multiple gunshots to his head and neck. Today, it could feasibly be considered one of history's most recognizable pieces of film footage. On November 22nd, Zapruder had been standing in a spot on Dealey Plaza where he was able to get a clear view of the presidential motorcade. But when the shots were fired, Zapruder became a direct and primary witness to the killing. Zapruder later told a reporter, "I saw the president lean over to Jacqueline, then the second shot came, and then I realized I saw his head open up and I started yelling, 'They killed him, they killed him!' And I continued shooting until they went under the underpass." The moment deeply impacted Zapruder's mental health. He said, "It's left in my mind like a wound that heals up, but yet there's a pain left as to what has happened." His camera was seized by the government and now sits in the National Archives. He was later given a new one but never touched it or any other camera ever again. The events of November 22, 1963 loom large in the history of the United States. The first presidential murder in more than 60 years unnerved the nation, especially since it had occurred during a time of relative peace and prosperity. Considering the vast impact of the assassination in the country's cultural memory, it might seem surprising that the actual timeline of events is so short. President Kennedy's plane, Air Force One, touched down at Dallas's Love Field Airport at 11:30 a.m. There, the first couple were greeted by the media and well-wishers. By 11:45 a.m., John and Jackie Kennedy, John Connally, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and their spouses had been loaded into open-topped cars bound for Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. The motorcade reached its destination at 12 p.m., slowly driving through the streets lined with more than 150,000 locals who wanted to get a glimpse at the president. At 12:30 p.m., Oswald opened fire, hitting Kennedy and Connally. Rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, Kennedy was pronounced dead 1 hour and 3 minutes later. And just 12 minutes after that, Oswald was arrested in a movie theater. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States on board Air Force One during a flight back to Washington. The entire course of events, from JFK's arrival in Dallas to Johnson's ascension, had occurred in a little over 3 hours.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet.
Within hours after the shooting of President Kennedy, police arrested Oswald, and the legal system worked quickly against him. The very next day, on November 23rd, Oswald was arraigned on charges relating to the murders of both the president and a police officer he killed during his escape. On November 24th, Oswald was transported from Dallas's police headquarters building to a county jail that could provide better security. And that's when things went wrong. Officials and members of the media crowded into the station's basement as police escorted Oswald through. Just then, local nightclub owner Jack Ruby pushed his way through the onlookers and shot Oswald at point-blank range. Oswald died from his wounds around 2 hours later. What's especially notable about Oswald's death is that it was witnessed live by potentially thousands, if not millions, of people. TV news crews were among the crowd in the police headquarters basement that day, and they were broadcasting the Oswald transfer live as it happened coast to coast. This made Oswald's death the first known televised murder in history and marked an ignominious end for one of American history's most mysterious criminals.
A few days after the assassination of her husband, President John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy sat down for an interview with Theodore H. White for a Life magazine story. White was a journalist and historian who received a Pulitzer Prize the year before for his coverage of the 1960 presidential election that J.F.K. had won. Though the interview started out slowly, Jackie suddenly rushed headlong into her memories of that horrific day in Dallas. She stared into space as she recounted the tragic story. As the presidential motorcade slowly made its way through downtown Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, Jackie Kennedy sat next to her husband. She was wearing a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat and white gloves. She cradled a bouquet of red roses she'd recently been given by well-wishers as she smiled and waved. Suddenly, she heard a crack. She thought it was the sound of a motorcycle backfiring, according to These Few Precious Days, a book by Christopher Anderson. According to the same book, Jackie recounted later that her husband had a quizzical look on his face, saying, "He looked puzzled. I remember he looked as if he had a slight headache."
President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas.
Her interpretation of the gunshots lasted only as long as it took to look at her husband. She told White, "Jack turned back so neatly. His last expression was so neat. I could see a piece of his skull coming off. He was holding out his hand and I could see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head. Then he slumped in my lap." An incident that Jackie had no memory of occurred just seconds after the shots rang out. At one point, she had lunged toward the back of the convertible in what many thought was an attempt to jump out of the vehicle. In truth, she was trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull that had landed on the car's trunk. After the shots were fired, their dark blue 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible began to race past the confused onlookers who lined the motorcade route. Jackie screamed, staring blankly into space. As the car continued onto Stemmons Freeway to Parkland Memorial Hospital, Jackie tried to hold her husband's head together. She leaned down close to him and whispered, "Jack, Jack, Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack." It was the last thing she said to her husband, who was barely alive, breathing raggedly, his pulse barely perceptible. 7 minutes later, they were at Parkland Hospital and he was still alive, but a half hour later, doctors declared him dead.
2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead.
When the motorcade arrived at the hospital, Jackie Kennedy refused to leave her husband's side. His body lay on a stretcher with one foot, wider than the sheet covering him, sticking out. Jackie went over and kissed him. She pulled back the sheet and looked at her dead husband. She recalled the moment later, saying, "His mouth was so beautiful. His eyes were open." She again kissed him, working her way up his body until she reached his lips. She held his hand while a Catholic priest gave him last rites. Hours later, a dazed Jackie was on Air Force One, still wearing her blood-splattered outfit at the swearing-in of Lyndon B. Johnson as the next president. Her husband's body, now in a bronze coffin, was also on board. On November 24th, the day JFK's body was to lay in state, Jackie and Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, went to the East Room in the White House to say one final goodbye before the casket lid was shut for the last time.
Its poignancy calls only for tears.
She snipped off a few locks of her dead husband's hair as she wept. Jackie moved to New York City and married the Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis in 1968. After his death in 1975, she became an editor at the book publisher Doubleday until her death in 1994 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She had wanted to live a life away from public view, something she was never able to achieve.
The country's first president was only about 2.5 years into his retirement when he suddenly took ill. From start to finish, the National Constitution Center says that Washington's illness lasted about 21 hours. By late afternoon of the day he passed, America's first commander-in-chief knew that the end was near. In the century since, medical professionals have debated exactly what killed the first president, and guesses range from diphtheria to an inflammation of the larynx, which would have caused the breathing difficulties that he experienced. One of the popular contenders now is acute bacterial epiglottitis. Here's what happened. Washington had been out riding on a cold, damp day and opted to stay in his wet clothes so he wasn't late for dinner. The next day, he sent for the doctors. And according to the University of Michigan's Dr. Howard Markle, if the illness didn't get him, the treatment did. That included bloodletting, and over the course of 12 hours, about 40% of Washington's blood was drained. In an attempt to try to open his airway, Spanish fly was applied in an awful treatment that causes blisters to form on the inside of his throat. There was also the administration of enemas. Additionally, Washington was given various concoctions to gargle, including one mix of butter, vinegar, and molasses. Nothing worked, and he thanked each doctor for their attempts at saving his life. Washington died at his home in Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799. He was 67. Historians at Monticello say that it's unclear just what killed Thomas Jefferson at the age of 83. However, they also note that in the years leading up to his death, Jefferson suffered from a massive list of health problems, which we know in part thanks to his extensive writings. His health started to go downhill after 1818, when he spent some time at the mineral baths of Virginia's Warm Springs. It was there that he developed a, quote, boil on his seat. Surprisingly, in spite of the deep infection on his bottom, he continued to take his daily horseback rides. That said, Jefferson's death was likely the result of his treatment being worse than his actual illness. Jefferson's infection was treated with ointments containing high amounts of mercury and sulfur, which did help get rid of the infection, but caused all kinds of other problems, like the, quote, chronic bowel problems he suffered from for years. Then, in 1825, he struggled with a bladder issue that necessitated the use of what was basically a catheter. This was before sterilization, though, and the bacterial damage that spread to his kidney sent him into a painful decline. Bedridden by June 1826, the nation's third president was also suffering from pneumonia and what doctors now believe was prostatic cancer. Jefferson died on July 4th, and since he was mostly in a semi-conscious stupor, his last words were unclear. Zachary Taylor made some serious statements as the 12th president, including telling the southern states who were threatening to secede that if they did, he would order the hanging of anyone caught rebelling against the Union. That declaration happened in February 1850. By July 9th, Tyler was dead, after just 5 days of a sudden and brutal illness. On July 4th, Taylor laid the cornerstone for the Washington Monument, ate a lot of fruit, drank some milk, and hours later, he was crippled with agonizing cramps, a fever, and severe gastrointestinal distress. He was then treated with then normal remedies like opium, mercury chloride, and quinine, but the symptoms never disappeared, and he died shortly after. Even though it was often repeated that he died from a reaction caused by eating cherries and drinking milk, History.com says it's more complicated. The official cause was cholera, but not everyone's happy with that, leading to conspiracy theories that Taylor's anti-slavery, anti-secessionism stance got him assassinated. How true that might be isn't clear. When Taylor's remains were re-examined in 2014, the chief medical examiner of Kentucky announced that the levels of arsenic in his system were completely normal. But the autopsy still hasn't been able to prove what really caused the sudden, excruciating illness that killed him. The medical examiner did add, however, that it's entirely possible that the medicine Taylor was given was more lethal than his actual illness.
He may have actually recovered from it, but the medical theories and practices of the day pretty much assured his death.
While Ulysses S. Grant might be remembered as one of the nation's most famous generals, the story of his death is nothing short of heartbreaking. It started in 1884, the year Grant realized that a shady investment banker had convinced him to invest his entire life savings into a pyramid scheme that ultimately collapsed. The bad investment left the Civil War hero and former president penniless. Even worse, a few months later, a visit to the doctor confirmed that his chronic throat pain was advanced throat and tongue cancer. Confronted with his imminent death, Grant realized that his previous financial miscalculation was going to leave his wife and family destitute. So, with the help of his old friend Mark Twain, he threw everything into one last-ditch effort to secure their future. Grant signed a contract to write his memoirs for Twain's new publishing house. What followed was a race against time and his advancing cancer. Fueled by pure grit, determination, as well as morphine and topical cocaine to dull the pain, Grant wrote as much as 10,000 words per day, first in his own hand and later while whispering to a stenographer. Within less than a year, Grant finished his 366,000-word memoir. And when Twain brought news that he'd already pre-sold 100,000 copies, Grant knew he'd provided for his family.
And Twain realizes at once that what Grant has written is a monument in American literature.
Grant died on July 23, 1885, 7 days after he finished writing. When the book was published, Julia Grant received royalties that today would equal around $12 million. When Charles Guiteau shot President James Garfield at the Baltimore and Potomac train station, the first shot nicked his arm, while the second embedded itself in his abdomen. The 20th president remained completely conscious, shocked throughout the entire episode. After the shooting, Garfield was subjected to some of the most brutal treatment in the medical history of the White House. If he hadn't been, there's a chance Garfield might have lived. The shooting happened in 1881, and it was a time when things like germ theory and sterilization hadn't gone mainstream yet. And that's important to keep in mind, because it puts things in perspective. Garfield was taken to the White House, where doctors became determined to remove the bullet from his abdomen. The working theory was that if it were left in, it would cause something called morbid poisoning and essentially cause his organs to fail. Not only did doctors not wash their hands before they went poking around inside his guts, the 3-inch wound left by the bullet was ultimately opened to 20 inches, and, unsurprisingly, infection and sepsis set in. Garfield survived for 80 days, during which he lost around 80 pounds. His last words were, quote, this pain. The official cause of death was massive hemorrhage, blood poisoning, and a heart attack. William McKinley was at Buffalo's Pan American Exposition on September 6, 1901, when he decided to ignore the advice of his advisors and hold a meet-and-greet handshake session with members of the public. That, says the National Constitution Center, is when he was shot by Leon Czolgosz. Initially, it was believed McKinley was going to survive. Doctors were so confident McKinley would live that his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, didn't return from his family vacation. One bullet was deflected by the buttons on his suit, and the other punctured his stomach and lodged in his abdomen. The emergency surgery that was performed was successful, and just a few days later, the president was even requesting copies of the newspaper to be brought to him in bed. On September 13th, though, McKinley took a turn for the worse. The unsanitary conditions in which he was operated on, which were still pretty common for the time, had led to gangrene forming on his stomach. That, in turn, led to a fatal case of blood poisoning, and he died early on the morning of the 14th. Countries across the globe declared official mourning periods to grieve the beloved president. Warren G. Harding might not be a household name anymore, but when he died suddenly in 1923, he was absolutely a topic of household conversation. Harding was on a 15,000-mile speaking tour when he started feeling pretty funky. Assuming that the indigestion, fever, and difficulty breathing, coupled with chronic signs of heart disease, was just stress from the trip, he kept going. Until, that is, the evening of August 2nd, when he suddenly collapsed and died. What followed was a lot of finger-pointing from the public, who accused Harding's doctors of everything from malpractice to incompetence. Then, in 1930, a former Harding official published a book claiming that Harding's long-suffering wife, Florence, had finally gotten so sick of his numerous affairs that she'd decided to put an end to it once and for all, the lethal way. Florence's case wasn't helped much by the fact that she'd ordered her husband embalmed immediately before any autopsy could be performed. Although the wild rumors that Harding had been poisoned were ultimately debunked, The scandals for the recently deceased president kept piling up. There were even rumors that Harding had at least one illegitimate child while in the White House. But here's the bottom line. Harding died of a heart attack. It's no less tragic of an ending for an American president, just less scandalous. It's commonly said that Franklin Delano Roosevelt hid the fact that he was crippled by polio from the public, but that's not entirely true. Major news outlets regularly mentioned his wheelchair, and he very publicly upgraded the White House to make it more wheelchair accessible. He did, however, hide other health problems that included things like hypertension and a severe iron deficiency. In 1944, FDR was looking at running for his fourth term, and according to the Washington Post, his health was so bad at that point that his doctors warned him not to do it. He suffered from fatigue and exhaustion, and a listen to his lungs revealed to doctors at Walter Reed that fluid was building up there. He was very slowly drowning. FDR, historians say, knew that he was dying, but he also knew that World War II was coming to an end, and he firmly believed that he needed to be there for it. FDR easily won another term, but while putting on a happy and optimistic face in public, he struggled with severe chest pains, high blood pressure, and illnesses like bronchitis. On April 12, 1945, FDR complained of a massive headache and died 2 hours later. He was 63. Lyndon B. Johnson took over after the assassination of J.F.K., only to leave the presidential office behind in 1968. From there, he did what he loved best, tending the animals on his Texas ranch. It was on his Texas ranch that Johnson suffered a massive heart attack on January 22, 1973. The former president died that same day. In the years after the presidency, Johnson became increasingly despondent that the good things he'd done, like overseeing the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, were overshadowed by the giant stain that was the Vietnam War. According to PBS, his depression was deep, so deep that he'd sometimes just sit and listen to Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water on repeat. With 3 heart attacks already on his medical record and regular heart and chest pains, it's not entirely surprising that Johnson's doctors had warned him way back in 1955 that if he continued to smoke, he would die early. Still, after 1968, Johnson went right back into his chain-smoking habit, claiming that it was better than facing his nerves and depression nicotine-free. LBJ said that he knew he was going to die young, which is why he didn't run for re-election. He told The Atlantic, "My daddy was only 62 when he died, and I figured that with my history of heart trouble, I'd never live through another 4 years. The American people had had enough of presidents dying in office." Johnson guessed he would die at the age of 64, and he did. It was 1994 when Ronald Reagan went to the Mayo Clinic. Reagan had been getting increasingly forgetful, and he and his wife Nancy already knew that something was terribly wrong. The diagnosis was Alzheimer's, and on November 5th of that year, Reagan penned what would be his last open letter to the country. In it, the former president wrote, "We feel it is important to share the Alzheimer's diagnosis with you. I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the time comes, I am confident that with your help, she will face it with faith and courage." Ronald Reagan died on June 5th, 2004, after what Nancy Reagan called a, quote, long goodbye. A family friend told Newsweek, "We all said goodbye 10 years ago, when he still knew who some of us were. She took responsibility in caring for what was left." By the time he broke his hip in a fall in 2001, doctors gave Reagan 3 months to live. He would, of course, live another 3 years, but family insiders revealed that while they were prepared for him to go, Nancy's grief began to set in only after her husband was buried. The insiders told Newsweek, "That was really the beginning of her pain. She's in that house all by herself." James Baker III, George H.W. Bush's former Secretary of State, was among the last to visit him before he died in 2018. Recognizing his old friend, the 41st president asked, "Where are we going, Bake?" When Baker replied that they were going to heaven, the former president agreed, telling him, "That's where I want to go." That was November 30th, and those who knew him best had been surprised that he'd lived that long after burying his beloved Barbara a few months earlier in April.
He really wasn't ready to go after Barbara died. In fact, he said so.
When he was hospitalized days after her death, ABC News says that those closest to him were preparing for him to follow her. His White House photographer said, "We thought, he's just dying of a broken heart." Bush was also suffering from vascular Parkinson's, according to the Michael J. Fox Foundation. This particular condition is caused by a series of small, sudden, and unpredictable strokes that impact a person's mobility, balance, and ability to speak. Bush had been confined to a wheelchair since 2012, and in 2017, he was the target of accusations of improper touching and groping while posing for pictures. According to USA Today, medical experts had explained that could have also been caused by his illness, as the former president's diagnosis included possible symptoms like performing involuntary behaviors that were not entirely under his control or volition. They cited things like Bush's seemingly forced smile as evidence, noting it was a common symptom known as, quote, abnormal grimacing. Thankfully, George H.W. Bush's passing was peaceful.